Welcome to Nightmares and Grief, a place to explore and celebrate the darkness. Each episode, I'll read stories written by me, Derek Heisey. So settle in, check under the bed, and pour a drink for the skeletons in your closet. It's time to start. It was a long meeting, and I couldn't believe it was still going. I'd been sucked into a hole, like a special layer of hell where time never passed through the worst part of the day. Hank from accounting kept droning on and on about double-ended bookkeeping, depreciated assets, and account liquidity. He was really digging into it, like he really cared, like accounts receiving was his true passion. But looking around the conference room, it was obvious I wasn't the only one who was struggling to follow his reasoning. Phone under the table, I sent a text to Evan, who sat on the opposite end of me. It read, "Kill me now." He waited a strategic 10 seconds before pulling out his phone and taking a peek. He smiled and bobbed his head. My phone vibrated a little while later, and I waited the safe 10 seconds before checking it. "Chinese after?" read the text. "Yes," I replied. Evan was my best friend, both at the office and outside of it. We'd been friends since college and managed to both get jobs at the company around the same time. It was serendipitous, but secretly, I partly thought it was meant to be. Evan was my ride or die. I told him everything. He was the only one to entertain my fascination with entomology. He'd watch some of the videos I sent him of centipedes feeding on grubs or scorpions fighting vinegaroons. He wouldn't watch spider videos, though. That was too much. I tried my hardest to focus on Hank's presentation, but my eyes drifted. My eyelids fluttered like butterfly wings making a landing, and my vision blurred. But something caught my attention. Hank had his back turned to us while he gestured at the projected presentation on the whiteboard. He was a fit guy who normally wore tight polo shirts. As he reached across the whiteboard to gesture over a pie chart of income return, the shirt spread taut over his back, and I swear something rippled underneath. It was long and thin, and at first I thought it was a crease in the fabric. It was massive and snake-like, but when it wriggled from the line of his spine to one shoulder and then the other, I knew it couldn't be the shirt. I sat up to attention and rubbed my eyes. I looked around the room, gauging the others' reactions. Everyone else seemed to be drifting off like I'd been. Had no one noticed? Or was I tired and seeing things? I turned back to study Hank, bright with the adrenaline pumping from surprise. I narrowed my eyes as I focused in on him, looking for the wriggle to come again. I wasn't even sure what exactly I was looking for, but at least it kept me awake at the meeting. I focused on his torso, squinting into the folds of the fabric as if attempting to divine meaning from them. I focused so hard that I almost missed the things in his neck. If I hadn't been looking for it, I might have originally dismissed it as an errant vein popping out in Hank's neck. However, there was sudden movement in the thing, like an errant flail, and it drew my eyes upward from the chest to the opening of his collar. Crawling up from beneath the collar of his polo, something snaked thick and worm-like. It squirmed up his neck, inching up the flesh and causing the skin to bulge and writhe. It pressed into Hank's jaw and into his cheek, where it twisted, undulating into bizarre, unsettling shapes. It darted further upward, darting across his forehead, thrashing meaninglessly until it disappeared into his hairline. Once again, I surveyed the room, searching for evidence that anyone had seen what I'd seen. Before me only sat bored expressions of pain, the half-dead ready to be released from their agony by a thigh slap, a smile, and an expression of, "That's all I got, folks." There was no indication at all that I was anything but crazy. The meeting inched by at a glacial pace, but when the thigh slap finally heralded its death knell, Evan and I were the first two up and out of the conference room. "Can't believe they let Hank go on that long about nothing," Evan grumbled. "I'm sure he thought it was important," I replied unsteadily. My mind drifted to the shapes I'd seen underneath his skin. My palms went moist and my throat unsettled, so I had to cough. Evan shook his head as we walked to the elevator. Inside, he hit the ground floor button with his elbow and then leaned back against the back wall. Another coworker approached, so I pressed the door open button to let them in. She smiled and thanked me, and I smiled back and told her it was nothing. On the ground floor, she parted ways. Hands in his pockets, Evan walked backward as he spoke to me. "I invited a few other people," he said. "What?" "Yeah. I hope you finally get Layla's number." My face and ears went hot. I had nothing to say. Evan left it at that, but not before he gave me a sly, sidelong smile. We walked out of the building and towards the Chinese place. Conversation between the two places was nothing unusual, but I sensed how off I was. My mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about what I'd seen, waiting for the moment when Evan would turn to ask me if I'd seen it too. It never came, though. We walked on, Evan talking about the same litany of things he'd normally go on about. Work, girls, video games, movies. He asked if I wanted to go shooting at the range again. No indication that anything had happened in the meeting. I began to doubt I'd even seen anything. Surely, if anyone had seen it, Evan would have, right? On the way, I peered down one of the alleys. A man stood in the back with his hands up while another man pointed something at him and whispered in sharp barks. The man with his hands up caught my eyes, and in his face was written a desire for help, but he was too afraid to call out. I looked away, shifting my gaze instead to my shoes. It wasn't my business. There wasn't anything I could do anyway. I looked at Evan, but he talked on as if he didn't notice. We continued as if nothing had happened. The restaurant's red and yellow neon sign loomed above us like a beacon in the night. The place boasted the best chow mein in the city. We waited for the others to arrive, with Evan beaming and greeting each one like a real host. I wasn't much good at helping him. The general funk from the walk occupied too much space in my mind. It took me a while, but eventually I got over it. I started acting more normally, but it was out of a strange compulsion. I felt I had to behave as if I'd never seen the things in Hank, otherwise something bad might happen. It was as if I were being assessed. I had a strange thought as we sat together, laughing and talking. Everyone from work seemed so distant, so far away, like everything they did or said was done from the bottom of a deep well. That's what it felt like, as if we were all talking to each other from different wells. I thought, these people can't be real. Their smiles seemed so forced, barely reaching their eyes, and their laughter rang hollow in my ears. They reminded me of bad sock puppets, skin stretched over a foreign agent controlling them, voice coming from somewhere else. It made it hard for me to eat. The chow mein was good, but these sock puppet people made my stomach turn. I couldn't eat much and ended up taking the rest home. Evan noticed. When we finished the hangout and walked back to the office parking lot together, he tapped my arm and asked if I was okay. I put on my most convincing smile and nodded. "Yeah," I replied, "I am just tired. Been a big week." Evan wasn't convinced, but he didn't press any further. We got to my car and parted ways with a fist bump. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being assessed still, even with Evan. It felt like I was being judged for the way I behaved. I did my best to suppress the feeling of being watched, stared at, even when I was alone, but it wouldn't leave. It must have been something in the chow mein, or the paranoid sensation must have gotten to me, because I was unsettled. I tossed and turned in bed, and when I did finally fall asleep, I had a nightmare. worms. When heavy rains hit, particularly in the south, you'll sometimes see a strange sight. Hundreds of worms will knot themselves together into a ball and writhe on the surface. Nobody is sure why they do it. Some researchers have suggested they're social beings and that physical contact, movement is one way they communicate. Others have said that it's a way to scare off predators when they're exposed on the surface. It's a disgusting sight, like fleshy spaghetti or deflated brains. I dreamed of those worm clusters, but I dreamed of them beneath the skin. I imagined a lattice of worms filling human-shaped sacks of skin, writhing beneath the material to make it move like a grotesque sock puppet. I dreamed of worms stretched tight, being plucked like a harp to produce the sounds of vocal cords. I dreamed of one who looked like my ex. She crawled into bed beside my paralyzed body, and beneath her skin, the worms rippled over her bones like tendons until at last thick, long bundles squirmed beneath her eyes and across her brow in anticipatory pleasure as she drew her face close. She hovered close enough that I could smell her earthy breath. Her lips parted slightly. The fear writhed in my gut like flagellum, but I was powerless to move. She widened her lips and a torrent of worms spilled out. Squirming, they landed on my face and lips, their wet, writhing bodies trying to enter any possible opening. My mouth, nose, even the space in the sockets around my eyes. I tried to flail away, to grab the pistol I kept under the bed, but she pinned me down with surprising strength and leaned in for a kiss. When her lips pressed against mine, more worms squirmed from her maw and pushed past my clenched lips, wriggling into my mouth. I tried to shut them out by clenching my teeth, but they wriggled by my cheeks. They squirmed. Their soft bodies pressed into my flesh and dug. Sharp, needle-like points pressed into my muscle tissue as the worms burrowed beneath the skin and ate away the meat, replacing it with their own vigorous, wriggling bodies. My body burned away as my mass was replaced by the cold, squishy flesh of fat, pink earthworms. And then I woke up. In the dream's struggle, the sheets had twisted around me, cold and soaked with my sweat. My heart flailed with mad desperation. I thought I'd die if it didn't slow down. I lay back down and focused on my breathing, studying the ceiling and waiting for my heart to calm down. In the dim light, the shadows nestling in the paint reminded me of worms. I shuddered, gagged, and nearly vomited. Once I finally calmed down, I went to the bathroom to inspect myself. I searched for evidence I had been penetrated by the worms, but fortunately found none. With no pains in my body and in full control of my faculties, I determined I was safe. But I was convinced the rest was real. After what I saw on Hank, combined with the visions from my dream, I was convinced the worms were real. I'd never been so certain of something in my life. I'd been granted a nightmarish vision of hell and been told it had arrived on Earth. I thought about the sensation I'd had in the restaurant, how I'd been convinced I was being assessed. The worms were real, and they were aware of me. They were watching me, verifying their knowledge, assessing me as a threat. I had to be careful, but having a mission focused me. The only way I could ever truly be safe was if I revealed them. I had to show the worms to the world. I made every effort to maintain a normal facade. I showered, shaved, and readied myself like I would any other day. I got to work on time, and I wore a huge smile on my face. But underneath the surface, all I could think about was how to identify the worms. While I typed out reports, I wondered if they took the bodies of others or if those people had always been sock puppets. It consumed me, and I'd need to observe them more before I could have my answers. A few days later, one of them fell into my lap. Evan was at a table in the break room, hunched over something I couldn't see. We texted some since the Chinese restaurant, but I'd been so distracted that I wasn't much for conversation. Something seemed to preoccupy him, too. I came up behind him and called out to him, but he didn't turn around. When I put my hand on his shoulder, he jumped and spun around. "Christ!" he exclaimed. "You scared me." "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he replied, offering an awkward smile. He pocketed his phone quickly, his hand moving close to his body as if he were hiding it. "I was just spacing." And that's when I saw it. One long, fat line rose up beneath his jawline and pressed against the skin. It pulsed once, bulging into a grotesque fishhook before disappearing again. It reappeared a moment later, writhing wildly and then darting down his neck and beneath his shirt collar. They'd gotten him. It had only been a few days since I discovered them, and they'd gotten Evan. Knowing that I knew, had they done it out of retribution? A way to send me a message? Stay out of it? I wanted to weep. The grief was tremendous, but I had to keep it together. I couldn't let the worms know how affected I was. I rubbed my eyes. Now it was Evan's turn to ask if I was all right. His movements seemed stiff, angular, and a little disjointed. He gesticulated with one hand while scratching his cheek with the other, an odd combination of movements I'd never seen him do before. His speech, too, seemed slower than usual, almost forced, like he was trying to squeeze words out that didn't belong. When we parted ways for the day, I had at least one answer, though the victory felt pyrrhic. The worms were flesh colonizers, skin snatchers, and once I was aware of them, the floodgates of realization opened to reveal them everywhere. One squirmed up the arm of the gas station attendant as she passed me change for a 20. As I sat on the park bench, I spied a fat one wriggling down the calf of a runner. Two wriggled like loose veins in the temple of the bank teller. The flesh colonizers were everywhere. I started documenting my encounters, first in the notes app of my phone, but the more I wrote in it, the more wary I became. I wondered if the flesh colonizers outnumbered the humans and if they weren't more clever than us to remain undetected for so long. Eventually, I transferred all of my digital notes into a notebook. Now they would need physical access to see my observations, not a mere digital hack. I kept the notebook with me at all times because of all the strange looks of those I'd identified as flesh colonizers. Evan, the regular attendant at the Circle K, Hank, and even a few co-workers. I seemed to live in the refrain of, "Are you okay?" and "You seem tense. What's wrong?" They asked me over and over, hoping I'd betray my secret, but I wouldn't. I couldn't. I would find a way to expose and eradicate the flesh colonizers, even if it meant destroying what remained of my friends. I documented in my journal faithfully, but found myself more and more alone. All I wanted was to destroy the skin snatchers, but being around them wearied me. It took increasing greater measures of energy, knowingly spending time with my enemy, draining me to the point of exhaustion. I had filled my notebook and started another, but I needed more. I needed definitive proof of my claims. I needed help. And in order to get that, I needed evidence. It took time, but I ordered mini cameras and pinhole microphones. I couldn't put them everywhere the flesh colonizers were, but I knew who I could start with. Evan was easy. As far as flesh colonizers go, he was remarkably trusting. He left his cubicle wide open and I installed the camera while he was in the bathroom. If anyone saw, they kept their mouth shut. Maybe my expression chilled them into silence. I felt the fierce creases in my brow and sensed the weight of unyielding determination pulling on the corners of my mouth. I imagine it frightened off the nosy and uncertain. Hank was trickier. He had an office I'd only been in a few times, so it was challenging to know where the camera should be placed. The solution came when Cheryl from accounting celebrated her birthday. Like a good boy, Hank abandoned his office to sing and eat garbage sheet cake with the rest of the drones. That was when I made my move. I slunk into his office with such ease and cunning that I impressed even myself. It took no time to find a place for the camera. He had so much memorabilia in his office, particularly awards from the corporate fascists, that there were endless knickknacks to sneak the camera behind. Once the cameras were installed, watching became my obsession. I studied both Hank and Evan's feed to the detriment of my daily duties. Rather than fill out spreadsheets and reports, mindlessly slogging for what I had come to realize must be my earthworm masters, I studied and analyzed the feeds, seeking whatever proof I could bring to the masses that the worms held dominion over us all. It did not go unnoticed. My boss, Gil Sullivan, called me in and sat me down across from him. He offered me a coffee and asked if I was doing all right. He wanted to know if something was bothering me. I swallowed a laugh and a smile. I told him no, I was fine. With a sigh, he pulled out a document and passed it to me. It detailed how many assignments I completed in a week for the past year. Its existence made my skin crawl. These worms had monitored my productivity all this time. No doubt they'd wanted to make sure I'd been a good little drone, that I'd been performing well enough to validate my existence. He leaned forward and tapped on the row indicating the past month. There was a significant dip. He said I didn't have to let him in if I didn't want to, but I did have to solve the problem of that dip. He clicked his pen a few times, peering at me over his glasses. That's when I saw them. The fattest worms I had ever seen writhed over his cheek, jaw, and forehead simultaneously, meeting in the center of his face where they flailed a final time before smoothing out and disappearing. I had suspected Sullivan was a flesh colonizer, but I hadn't been certain until that moment. The worm's sheer size and sudden irregular behavior startled me. I slid the chair backward away from the desk before willing myself to regain control. Sullivan cocked his head at a curious angle, furrowing his brow against the squirming lines of worms.
Sam, are you sure you're all right? We're worried about you.
Of course, I thought. Of course you're worried. You're worried because you know I'm on to you and I'll find a way to prove it. You know your days are numbered, skin snatcher. That's what I wanted to say. I wanted to scream it from the top of the building, but that would have been a mistake. Even though he knew I knew, we both had to continue our elaborate dance, playing pretend with quiet pleasantries. I told him I was fine. I lied lamely that I thought I'd seen a spider. It was clear he didn't buy it, but he didn't press further. Sullivan dismissed me. On my way out, I knew I had to get his office too. Somehow I knew Evan and Hank would never reveal their natures alone, but perhaps if Sullivan called them to his office, they would let their guard down. They might reveal their true natures while in conference with a worm of higher rank. I saved up for another camera, and while I did so, I made every effort to be kind and charming, particularly to Sullivan. I abandoned the other cameras, resolute in my new assertion that Sullivan was the ticket to proof. I became convinced that 2 or more flesh colonizers in a room together alone would reveal themselves in grotesque ways. I imagined their heads exploding into a bouquet of writhing pink vines. I made myself the model worker, arriving early and staying late, producing more than ever before, and making it all with a smile. Sullivan's concern dissipated as I buried myself in work, and soon he forgot me again. Everything returned to the status quo, and the world once again became seamless and gray. The day came when I received the new camera. I stayed late on Friday, pretending to work on a report I'd already turned in earlier in the week. I typed away at a spreadsheet, inserting meaningless numbers into purposeless formulas, waiting for everyone else to leave. Once I was certain I was the only person left in the building other than the cleaning staff, I snuck into Sullivan's office. It was locked, as I'd anticipated, but I'd watched lockpicking YouTube videos all week and had practiced at my apartment. I made sure the cleaners were on the other side of the office when I cracked the lock. The click of the door's latch hit my ear like beautiful music, and I snuck inside, ensuring the door closed without sound behind me. Sullivan's office was unfamiliar to me. I'd only been inside a few times, and unlike Hank, Sullivan kept it tight. Aside from his diploma on the wall and a family photo on the desk, he didn't have much adorning his walls. I thought it was odd. There's an indelible urge to make a space where you spend most of your time your own, and Sullivan completely ignored that human desire to leave his mark. Clearly, this was further proof that he was a worm. I sat in his chair, trying to understand what it was like to be Sullivan. The family photograph caught my eye. A beautiful wife and an adorable daughter. I picked it up, looked closely, harboring something akin to unfamiliar nostalgia. I wondered about them, what they were like, what kind of people they were. Darkness descended over my heart like the metal curtain of a fireplace. Sadness and disgust intertwined as I wondered, were they worms too? The little girl was maybe 8 or 9. A twang of remorse struck my heartstrings. Either her father had been taken from her without her knowledge, replaced by a colony of writhing worms, or she was one too. Both outcomes broke my heart. Soon, a deep fury overwhelmed the sadness. How dare they, I thought. How dare those worms come to the surface and take away our lives? It deepened my resolve. I had to find a way to uncover the flesh colonizers and destroy them, for the woman and the little girl in this photo, for the father and husband whom they had lost. Behind Sullivan's desk, there was a shelf built into the wall. I found a space situated higher on the shelf where the camera would be hidden from general view, but still see the people entering his office. I didn't have to focus on Sullivan's camera as much as I had with Hank and Evan. My cubicle was close enough to the office I could see who entered or exited, so I checked the cameras accordingly. Whenever a known worm entered, I opened the program and looked. It made it easier to focus enough on my work so as not to draw attention from Sullivan. Evan asked several times in the week if I wanted to go have lunch, but I declined. The invitation set me on edge. It seemed random, as we didn't usually eat lunch together. It was foreboding, and it made me wonder if he was on to me. Something about the way he said it, maybe his expression or his tone of voice, it made me wonder if he knew about the cameras. Had I missed something when I stopped paying attention to his feed and focused instead on Sullivan's? The concern deepened when, once, I think he caught a glimpse of Sullivan's feed. Big and boisterous, he barged into my cubicle like he was trying to surprise me, and, astonished I didn't have enough time to close the window before his hands were on my shoulder. He asked, What are you watching? As I closed the window, I made up a lame excuse that it was an experimental film. I was taking a break and got engrossed in it. He eyed me sidelong, inspecting me warily, and said we should hang out and watch it together sometime. I offered a non-committal, yeah, sure. And with a plastic smile, I stared at him and waited for him to leave. He heaved a monumental sigh, and his eyes shifted. The glimmer faded from mischief to dull concern. Then came the words that had become the bane of my existence. Sam, are you all right? Of course, I replied. I just spaced out watching a dumb movie, that's all. I'm worried about you, he added, as he always did. You're not yourself anymore. It's like you've been replaced. I almost snorted. Nice try, flesh colonizer. Clenching my teeth to hold back the laughter, I offered Evan's skin snatcher my biggest, warmest smile. Don't worry, I reassured. I've just had a lot on my mind. Besides, I'm the same Sam I've always been. Evan ran his tongue over his teeth while sighing through his nose. He glanced at my computer, which now displayed spreadsheets, and then at me. He shrugged. All right. He heaved out the word like unloading a burden, like it was something heavy and unpleasant, and hesitated. For a moment, I thought he was going to say more, but at last he shook his head and turned away. I recorded this strange encounter in my journal almost immediately. It left me unsettled. What did it mean? What was going to happen? I brushed it off as paranoia. It was just a flesh colonizer going through the motions of a concerned friend to keep me off my guard. There was nothing to worry about, I told myself. But it turns out I wasn't safe. They were on to me. The next day, Sullivan called me into his office. Lines creased his brow with grave severity, and the worms swarmed about his neck like static. It took all my willpower to keep my eyes above his jaw and off the shapes whipping about his neck. We sat in silence for a minute as he seemed to think of how to begin. He took off his glasses and groaned while he pinched the bridge of his nose.
Sam, I really don't want to fire you.
He went on to explain why, listing qualities he and the company liked about me. He stressed those positive qualities, and I couldn't help but think he was leaning too hard, protesting too much at what was inevitable. The unspoken words lingered in the air like a dense fog. They practically stuck to the inside of my lungs. When I was about to tell him to get on with it, he relented.
Sam, you've been slacking off at work, and worse, another employee reported that you were spying on individuals in the office. He held up the little camera between his thumb and forefinger. My stomach dropped into my bowels. The worms swarming around his neck stilled, their movements softening to a languid pulse while creeping up his skull and covering his face with writhing lines. Their bold motions gave me the stark impression they were gloating. By being so out in the open and appearing so calm, they announced their awareness of me, had seen my threat, and, according to the flesh colonizers, had neutralized it. Sullivan held the camera forth as if to let me inspect it more, saying, This kind of behavior is completely unacceptable. You know that.
Beneath his cheeks' skin, the worms bulged, pulsing in a quick but relaxed rhythm. They were laughing at me.
I need you to pack up your things and leave, Sam. Your services are no longer required.
The worms continued their silent laughter, mocking me still. My face and ears went hot. This was Evan's fault. Evan must have ratted me out. Or rather, the skin snatcher posing as Evan must have. The real Evan would never have done such a thing. Hatred and grief burned in my stomach, bubbling hot like boiling tar. I ran into him as I walked shamefully back to my cubicle. A cheerful grin spread wide across his smooth face as he asked how I was doing. The black tar in my gut burned hotter. He must have already known. He had to have understood the chain of events. Surely he and Sullivan had talked about it, cackling. My expression must have betrayed what had transpired in Sullivan's office, but I told him anyway. His face dropped. He stammered a little as his eyes went wide, and he wore a convincing mask of concern. But the worms rippled up from his neck, scurrying up his face. One group collected at each side of his mouth, while two more collected above his eyebrows. The groups at his mouth rallied into a line, continuing from the corner of his lips, while the ones above his eyebrows formed into circles. A smiley face. They had organized themselves into a smiley face, pulsing in laughter like the ones in Sullivan's office. Evan put a slow, wary hand on my shoulder. "Maybe it's for the best," he muttered. "You've been under a lot of stress. I think it's for your own good to take some time off." I don't think the flesh colonizer that had taken over my friend anticipated the blow, but it did notice something shift within me. Evan's concerned expression dropped, leaving the broken arc of his skin snatcher smile dangling, broken and lame on opposite sides of his face. His eyes took on an uncertain, almost fearful glint to them. I reached back my fist and sent it flying into Evan's nose, thinking about all the good times we'd once had and how only a few short weeks ago I never would have dreamed of doing what I'd done. But Evan wasn't Evan anymore. He was a flesh colonizer, a mass of worms stuffed into a skin suit. I couldn't think of him the same way. The expression in the flesh colonizer's eyes almost broke my heart. As he gingerly inspected his nose with a tender hand, betrayal shone in his eyes. I had to remind myself over and over again that it wasn't really Evan. It wasn't the real Evan. I envisioned the colony of worms writhing beneath the skin, moving the remaining flesh like a sock puppet. By now, the whole office gaped at us. Dozens of eyes lingered on me, waiting expectantly for my next move. These drones' pathetic intrigue filled the room so densely I could have cored it like an apple. I flexed my hand and gritted my teeth. Then I punched Evan again. I asked him why. I shouted at him, speaking to the things controlling his body, addressing them directly as worms. I asked why they chose Evan, what they wanted, and what their plans were. The flesh colonizers were adept actors. They feigned confusion expertly. I grabbed him by the shirt and told the flesh colonizer I had loved Evan, and it would rue the day it took him if it was the last thing I did. Security escorted me out soon after. Someone must have called them when I'd first hit the thing pretending to be my friend. I didn't get to grab my things. I drove back to my apartment in silence. I didn't play any music. I didn't mutter to myself. I thought about the flesh colonizers and how they'd ruined my life, first taking my friend and then my job. I wondered what else they would do to me if I continued my pursuit of unveiling the truth. I wondered how deep their power went. Was my life in danger? I pondered this as I entered my apartment, tossing my keys on the table beside the door and kicking off my shoes. How far would they go to suppress the truth from getting out? What drastic measures might they take? I thought about them, the disgusting flesh colonizers, and how well they outwardly appeared to be human. I thought about the photos on Sullivan's desk. I remembered the little girl, and red-orange rage swelled in my breast. The skin snatcher who had taken Sullivan had taken him away from her, or worse, had also taken her. there existed a little girl who would never grow up normally. The more I mulled the prospect over, the more I realized it must be true, and the more it broke my heart. I decided if anyone should be taking drastic measures, it should be me. I got on my hands and knees beside the bed and grabbed the case with my father's pistol. It had to be Sullivan. He was the leader of the creatures. Evan had reported to him after all. If I was going to make an impact, it would have to be through him. The next day, I shoved the gun into the waistband of my jeans and threw a baggy hoodie over top of everything. Then I drove to work. As soon as I entered, the security guard in the front stood up and held a hand out to me. I raised my hands as if to indicate I was no threat and told him I was just there to pick up my stuff. "You guys kicked me out before I could grab it," I said. "I need to get it back." The security guard eyed me warily, clearly mulling his options over. His training had never prepared him for something like this. I'm sure when he signed up, he'd expected nothing of consequence to ever happen at all. Unless he was corrupted by the worms, too. I wondered if he, to some level, knew he was expected to make humans subordinate to him. I wondered how many of them were even in the building. I wondered for a moment if I was perhaps the only remaining human left in the entire company. Maybe everyone was a skin snatcher now, and I was evicted before they could convert me. Maybe they would sneak into my bedroom now, so to force conversion upon me. It wouldn't be long. I had to act. I headed up the elevator to the 4th floor offices. In the elevator, I flipped my hood up over my head. If the security guard had recognized me so easily, it would be no challenge for my former coworkers to suspect something amiss. If backed into a corner, I still had the cover story of my office things needing to be collected. I didn't need to be ignored for long anyway. Soon, it would be impossible to ignore me. As I weaved through the cubicles, Evan's head peeked above some of the stalls. He had a bulky bandage over his nose, and I nearly snorted. I'm sure flesh colonizers regenerated their meat puppets quickly. I doubted they even felt pain. It was a show. It must be put on for the benefit of the humans in the building. Or perhaps they were so engrossed in their farce that they enjoyed keeping it up amongst each other, like some macabre costume party spanning their entire lives. Regardless, he'd be upset if he saw me. I kept my head down and hustled faster through the cubicles. Too late. I hazarded a glimpse in his direction, and just as I did, he caught my eye. Bad luck. Immediately, he started after me. "Sam!" he called. "Sam, hey!" I took bigger steps, trying to maintain a calm speed while advancing far enough to lose him. I tried ducking into the break room and exiting through the door on the other side, looping farther away from my intended destination. I heard him enter the room as I exited, calling after me. I thought I heard him tell someone to call security. It was time to get moving. I couldn't waste another second. I jogged through the cubicle rows, heading straight for Sullivan's office. I pushed past startled and offended coworkers, their faces flashing with recognition after I crashed into them. Soon I was like the Pied Piper with a trail of disgruntled office workers sporing behind me. I burst into Sullivan's office and drew the gun. He looked up from his computer and scowled, not immediately recognizing me or the threat. His face bloomed with shock as first he stood to meet me as an interloper, then seeming to process who I was until finally understanding the gun pointed at his head. The moment his brain recognized the black hunk I held was a pistol, his irritated but relaxed posture immediately straightened and his hands went up to his shoulders, palms facing out. I wasted no time despite his protests, moving around the desk. I trained the gun on his head, pressing it against his temple when I was close enough and wrapping my arm around his neck from behind. "Move," I growled, "or I'll blast the worms in your skull across the wall." He babbled that he had no idea what I was talking about and said if I needed to talk about the termination, we could do it calmly. I pistol whipped him across the top of his skull for that and screamed at him to shut up. "Move!" I yelled again. "To the elevator!" I shoved him forward and finally he complied, babbling words of concession as he went.
His office opened into a throng of drones collected around it. As soon as we exited, he screamed for help. I cracked him across the skull again, dug the barrel of the pistol into his head and pushed him. I barked at him to shut up, squeezing my arm tighter around his neck. I thrust the gun at the onlookers and my stomach churned with sickening pleasure as they recoiled at the sight of it, gasping and receding into the office when the barrel pointed in their direction. "Don't try to stop me," I barked. "I'll shoot anyone who tries." A figure lurched forward, shouting my name. I didn't even process who it was. I had a mission. Truth was on the line. I raised the gun and fired, but I didn't fire once. I shot twice. Evan went down like a sack of flour. My breath caught in my throat, sticking there like a hot, wide lump. My eyes burned, but I blinked away the pain, gritted my teeth, and swallowed. "See?" I screamed. I pushed the sound hard through my throat to hide the crack in my voice. "I mean it! Don't try to be a hero! You're on the wrong side of history!" On the floor, Evan squirmed and groaned. Beneath him, blood darkened the low pile carpet in a radiating, irregular circle. The hot lump came back to my throat like a clenched fist. For the first time since I started my crusade, I wondered if I was wrong. I swallowed the lump along with the doubt. I swung the gun at the onlookers in an arc, roaring mindlessly. The office workers screamed and scattered, opening a path to the elevators. The screaming stopped when I got inside and pressed the gun's muzzle to Sullivan's throat. "Flesh colonizer," I growled. "You're responsible for all of this." Sullivan shook his head and repeated, you're crazy," over and over again. His hands trembled and he licked his lips constantly. I studied his face in the reflective surface of the elevator's doors and found it remarkably curious that the worms were nowhere to be seen. I studied his expression as the elevator descended, searching it for some sign he was thinking about rebelling or revealing his true nature. There was nothing but the glimmer of fear in his eyes, uncertainty lining his brow, and a little fury twitching at the corner of his mouth. "Your time is over, flesh colonizer," I muttered. "I'll prove you are what I've seen. I'll show the whole world what's inside you."
"Whatever, Sam. Whatever you say."
He said it not as a placating concession, but rather as a tired parent might to their misbehaving and exasperated child. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open. Security must have been called and notified because they were ready. None of them were armed, though, so like the office workers on the 4th floor, they shirked at the sight of my gun. A pleasurable chill scurried up my spine. No one had ever listened to me like this before. I'd never wielded this much power in my life. Part of me, a big part of me, wanted to use the gun for the sake of using it. I had a mission, but I would never have an opportunity to feel like this again. I fantasized momentarily about shooting one of the security guards in the groin and watching him collapse to the ground, clutching his wound and weeping while his comrade held up his hands and backed away. But I resisted the temptation. I kept my eyes on my mission, kept my eyes on the pursuit of truth, and advanced slowly through the lobby. I told the security guards the same thing I told the workers upstairs. Don't be a hero. Don't try to stop me. I told them I'd already shot one person and I was more than willing to shoot more. Leave me alone to take Sullivan, I explained, and no one would be hurt. The guards exchanged uneasy glances with each other, but when I raised my gun and sent a shot into the ceiling, they relented. They raised their hands and backed away. Sullivan's jaw dropped, and he glared at them in dumbfounded admonishment. We got to my car before the police arrived. I kept the gun on Sullivan the entire time we drove back to my apartment. I think he considered taking the gun away from me. Once, his hand twitched as if to reach for it, but he ultimately decided against it. He behaved the entire way. I drove too fast, I think, for him to risk a struggle. I ran at least 2 red lights and swerved in and out of traffic like a needle and thread. Getting him up to the apartment was going to be tricky. I only hoped there wasn't anyone at the front desk by the elevators and that we didn't encounter anyone on the way. I was sure he was going to scream regardless, but if I got him into the apartment, I could do my work before the police got to me. Then they'd see the truth. They'd have to believe me once I reveal Sullivan's true nature. I looked out at the front desk. Nobody was present. They were probably showing the property around to somebody, but I wasn't so lucky at the elevator. When it arrived on the first floor, someone got off. Sullivan flailed and begged them to call the police. I hit him again and then turned the gun on the woman, who scurried out of the elevator with her head ducked down and her hands in the air. "Mind your own business," I growled, "or I'll find you." She nodded furiously and hurried away. Sullivan wept. I pushed him into the elevator. Sure enough, when we got to my floor, Sullivan started screaming for people to call the police. By then, I'd had enough. I needed him alive for what I wanted to do. I was convinced that killing the host body would kill the flesh colonizers inside, but that didn't mean I couldn't influence his silence. I pressed the gun against his shoulder and pulled the trigger. He screamed wordlessly and staggered forward, his right arm dangling uselessly at his side, and I jabbed him onward. "Move!" I growled. "I'm not going to say it again." No one exited their apartments. No faces peered from tiny cracks in the door. It was a ghost town. I was blessed with a confluence of cowards. When we got to my apartment, I shoved the keys in his hand and ordered him to open it. The glow of power that had crackled about my eyes, knuckles, and chest had dissipated now. My patience was thinner than paper, and I think Sullivan detected it, if not from my tone and the attitude I radiated, then from the hole in his shoulder. Once the door was open, I pushed him inside and snatched the 2 pairs of handcuffs I'd placed at the little table beside the door. I led him to the kitchen table and instructed him to put 1 pair on each wrist. Shaking, trembling, weeping, he complied, all the while babbling to me that I didn't have to do this, that it wasn't too late to stop. Well, he was wrong about that. It was far too late. There was only one way forward now. I bound him to the legs of the table. He lay there, strewn about, spread akimbo, weeping. I wasn't fooled. Worms have no limbic system. He could cry all he wanted, but I knew it was false. Crocodile tears. I ignored his petitions for mercy, deafened my ears to his bargains as he bled out onto my table, and disregarded his false promises. I expected almost for him to cave and confess. I expected to hear that I had won, expected to hear lies, that I would be rewarded with truth of the proof if only I let him go, but no such offers came. I was a little disappointed, but I wouldn't have trusted him anyway. I went into the kitchen and grabbed the paring knife from the block. I needed something sharp and maneuverable. I was going to cut Sullivan open and reveal the worm colony writhing inside of him. I was going to slice open the sock puppet and reveal the puppeteer inside. I was going to record it all. Then people would understand. Then people would believe me. Everything I did today would be justified if I just showed everyone the worms. I set up my phone on the hutch facing the table so the front-facing camera showed both of us on the screen as it recorded. "This is it," I said to the camera. "This will be proof. You will finally believe me after this." I raised the knife. Beneath me, Sullivan shifted from begging to railing against me. Now that he understood his fate, he screamed obscenities at me, hurled insults, and thrashed about, trying futilely to break his bonds. The warm feeling of power filled me once again. Confidence swept over me, and I felt for the first time in my life like I was truly, completely in control. I raised the knife higher and then my door burst open. I whirled around to see a SWAT team aiming rifles at me, shouting simultaneously so their words were indecipherable. "Wait!" I shouted. "Wait, please! Just let me prove the worms are inside! I need to show the world the truth!" One of the officers descended upon me and cracked the butt of his rifle across my jaw. The paring knife clattered to the floor and I fell to my knees. The officers surrounded me, training the muzzles of their rifles on me. A cacophony of shouts and orders swarmed the air around me, mixing into an indecipherable mess of phonemes and syllables. I felt their meaning rather than comprehending their words. I put my hands behind my head and lay on my stomach. It was over. I had failed. The officers found the keys to the handcuffs on Sullivan's wrists and freed him. Then they locked their own cuffs on me. They hauled me away. The drones must have called the police after I left the office. I was well known there, but who am I kidding? I know exactly who told them where I was going. It was Evan. It had to be. No one else knew my address. He had survived and told them where to go. The police tossed my apartment afterwards. I'm sure they did because they ended up finding my journals. The lawyer they appointed me was convinced that my best defense was insanity, but whenever he said that, I'd just repeat again and again that I wasn't crazy. The worms were there. I sought them in my defender's face, but I think they knew how close they'd come to being exposed and were hiding now, laying low, trying their hardest to stay undetected. I hadn't seen any in the faces or bodies of the officers or guards who handled me. They remained eerily absent from my life, but I could still feel them. I could practically smell them, the earthy scent of ozone after it rains. No, I told the public defender, I wasn't crazy. So he went over my head and told the judge I couldn't assist in my own defense. Two things were key in finding me guilty: my journals and Evan's testimony. He was emotional and compelling and everything they wanted him to be when he told the story of how his best friend had lost his mind. He recounted the story of how I'd punched him in retribution and explained that the man I was a month ago never would have done such a thing. He couldn't explain my sudden change, but it was evident to everyone. And then something happened. Before he finished his testimony and left the stand, Evan turned to face me. We locked eyes, and then, just as they had the day I punched him, the worms beneath his skin coalesced about his mouth and brow, forming a smiley face. I leapt to my feet and pointed. "Look!" I screamed. "Let's see them! See the worms? They're right there, smiling at me!" Of course, no one witnessed them. They were blind. The outburst didn't help. I lost the case and they had me committed, though I suppose no one gets committed anymore. I was put in mandatory inpatient psychiatric care. They're kind to me here, mostly. Sometimes they reveal their true nature, but that's because they're biding their time. I know what they are. I've seen it, crawling just beneath the skin. I've seen the worms writhe beneath the skin of the orderlies, spelling out messages that if I had a journal to copy down the letters, I'd be able to interpret. They're mocking me. I know that's it. They want me to know they've won and I'll die here. But I have plans. I'll do what they tell me to. I'll let them move me around like a puppet, and once I've got one alone and relaxed, I'll claw the worms out of them. I'll show everyone that their humanity only goes skin deep.
Thank you for sharing my nightmares and helping me carry the grief. If you enjoy the show, please share your favorite nightmare with a friend or family member. Don't forget to leave a rating. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications.
If you'd like to go the extra mile, you can join my Patreon for $3 a month and you can cancel at any time. Or you can buy my book on Amazon. I've put links to both in the description. I'd love to connect with you on Instagram, Facebook, or Threads. Just look for Nightmares and Grief and you'll find me. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Good night.